For about the next 1 hour and a half or so, we want to spend some time further exploring the topics and the ideas that we met last night, and we want to understand them in a local context as well. And so this morning we've collected a number of farmers to help give local context to the ideas and the dynamics that we met in Paul's film last night. We've aimed in assembling this panel to gather diverse experience, whether many years or few years, whether a large operation or a compact operation, whether harvesting proteins and carbs of diverse sorts, whether locations and responsibilities of diverse sorts. Each of the panelists that we've brought together this morning contribute to that diversity and our larger sense of understanding. What seems to be common between them all is a passion for the vocation. And in some sense, a spiritual grounding or commitment that embraces the purpose of farming, the purpose of our existence, and a sense of place in our common life together. And so we're grateful for the time that these folks have made to start shaping our thoughts this morning. Let me just lay out how this is going to proceed a little bit. So we've suggested a number of questions to our panelists. These are the 5 questions we suggested to them. Describe your farming operation. What do you enjoy about farming? What do you wish was not part of your farming operation? How do your Anabaptist Mennonite identity and spirituality thoughts influence or intersect with your vocation? And what about those current issues? Just barely touched on last night. How do current issues, or what current issues, affect the way you farm? What do you meet in your farming? So those are the 5 questions we've given as forming questions. We've only given them 5 to 7 minutes to answer all that. We know that's an impossible task, but we need somebody to start setting the context for us so that we can have further table conversations, and then we'll have a larger full room conversation. So we'll hear the panelists and their reflections on it, and I'll be fairly draconian with the time, so that's my job to keep us sort of in time. Then we'll have about 10-20 minutes of table talk where we can further hash out some of these conversation pieces and topics, and then we'll finish up in the big room. Does that make sense? It's okay? Good. Then we won't do a mid-course correction on that. These are the folks who we have coming. So what I'll do is invite them to stand where they are when I mention their name, and then in that same order to come forward and speak and return to your tables, because that's where the conversation will happen. And then when we come to full room conversation, I'll ask you to come and sit at the table here, or in the chairs here. So first is Sarah Martin Mills. I invite you to stand. Growing Hope Farm. She's been dabbling since she was a teenager, and describes her farm as an everything farm. Mostly livestock, goats, chickens, starting, and this year pigs? Yeah. There you go. Also some eggs and fruit and few vegetables. Thanks for coming, Sarah. You can be seated. Second is Angie Koch from Fertile Ground Farms. It's been in operation since 2008. She's been farming for about 13 seasons, an organic market garden, sell produce locally through a community shared agriculture program, a few restaurants, some small retail stores, and the Kitchener Farmer Market. Thanks for coming, Angie. Third is Mark Reusser, has a broiler and chicken and cash crop operation. You want to just stand and recognize?
It's turkeys, by the way.
Oh, it's turkeys? You better tell the OFA, change that on the website. has been involved in the Ontario Federation of Agriculture for about 6 years, the last 4 as vice president. So we're grateful for the time this morning. Shirley and Lloyd Frey sit at the back of Frey Farms in Golden View, Holsteins. They run a dairy and cash crop operation and some custom field work. Into the 3rd generation of family farming, we're grateful that you're here. And then finally, Chris Mullet Koop of Elmwood Farms, commercial egg farmer and a grape grower in the Vineland, Jordan area, into the 5th generation?
I'm the 5th, yeah.
There we go. So we've got some experience in the room, and we're grateful for the way you're going to give some context to our conversation. Sarah, why don't you begin?
So, my name is Sarah. I'm a first-generation farmer. Well, my stepdad was a farmer, and he hated it so much as a kid. I think he said he had nightmares about getting cabbage ready for market and taking it to Kensington Market in Toronto. So he was vehemently against any of us going into farming. Thought it was. He was like, don't do it. So we're a not-for-profit farm. We have 5 acres in Cambridge, just south of here. We operate as a not-for-profit. So that means that we have people who are marginalized in the community come and volunteer on the farm. So we have women from GVI come, we have at-risk youth come, we have people with developmental disabilities all come and work on the farm during the week, and then we sell all of the produce to the community at large. And then all of the proceeds from the farm are donated to MCC's food security program. So to date, we've donated about $32,000 to MCC's food security program in the last 3 years, which is really exciting. So we are kind of an everything farm. We are organic in some of our areas. The goats are not organic because of milk replacer and grain and all that kind of fun stuff. So the main things on our farm are goats, and we get them donated from a dairy goat farmer up in Palmerston, and he gives us the bucks. We raise those bucks for meat and sell the meat as pasture-raised goat meat, and we can sell it at a really high price, which is great. And then fruit is the other main thing, and eggs. So those are kind of the 3 main things. What do I enjoy most about farming is being outside. I love to work hard and be outside. I enjoy being with the animals. I enjoy the sense of accomplishment that you get when you can drop off the goats at the abattoir and you know that that's a good product. I enjoy seeing the literal fruits of your labor when you've done a good job, and when you've struggled with something for so long, trying to get the Japanese beetles out of your raspberries or whatever the situation is, and then that you figure out a solution and then it works. So what do I wish was not part of my farm was we have, for the past 3 years, invited the public onto the farm, and it's a great money-making revenue stream for the farm, but it is really difficult to have members of the public who are not aware of farming onto the farm and judging how you take care of your animals and how you run your farm. And so in some ways, I see it as education to the public, and in some ways, I'm like, get off my farm. But it makes a lot of money for the farm, and so yes, so it's a double-edged sword. We're cutting back the number of days this year, so I'm hoping to not get burnt out by it this year. So I'm like, okay, round 2, here we go. How does my Anabaptist identity and spirituality? I see myself as extremely privileged. We all here are part of the 1% of the world, and I take that very seriously. I think God's given us this, I don't know why God let me be born in Canada as a white female, but I have a lot of privilege with that, and I think Jesus talks a lot about wealth and the distribution of wealth to the poor, and so that weighs heavily on me a lot. And so we make sure to I run the farm as a volunteer and have a part-time job on the side that helps pay the bills. And so I see giving back money to the local community and to the global community as part of our farming system really important, and as an expression of our faith. Current issues, we've done kind of a assessment of our farm in terms of climate change and that sort of thing. We're really small and we back onto a river, and so we're lucky in terms of aggregate, like irrigation and that sort of thing, that we have access to free sources of that. I don't know, who knows what's going to happen in the future, and we could be underwater in 20 years. But we are trying to kind of do our farm as organically as possible, and manage the manure and manage we don't spray anything. And so we're trying to, I just got a tractor this year donated, so we're trying to use our tractor as less as possible. And so all of our farming practices are trying to, in its imperfect way, not contribute to climate change.
My name is Angie Koch. I come from a farming family, but it skipped a generation. So I didn't grow up on a farm. I grew up in a city. I went to a city church, a city Mennonite church. I had relatives and church family friends with city jobs. And so for me, being a Mennonite was not at all about being a farmer, and wasn't even inherently connected to a landscape. What I wanted to be when I grew up was in line with what any good city Mennonite might see as an appropriate vocation. I saw myself going into social work, and that's indeed what I did. I came here to Grebel, studied at Reusser in social development studies, and I came to farming as a second career, and you can tell that I'm definitely an urban person because I dare to call farming a career. So the context that I speak from is as a Mennonite who farms, but I'm not sure I really see myself as a Mennonite farmer. Since 2008, I've been farming what is now a 10-acre garden just west of Waterloo near St. Agatha. It's on 100 acres of rented land, and every year I have about 4 acres in vegetable production. We do, my farm's called Fertile Ground. I have a highly diverse vegetable operation, and the focus is on growing really high quality vegetables, growing them organically, distributing them locally, and really trying to draw people into their food story. We talk about inspiring people to get excited about their food. Most of my vegetables are distributed through a model called community shared or community supported agriculture. You may have heard of CSA, or you may not. It's a model of food production that connects farmers directly with eaters. And so people become members in the farm, and they pay up front for a share of the harvest, which is distributed every week in the form of whatever vegetables happen to be in season at that point in time. My job is to make sure that I have a bountiful harvest with a good diversity and balance of vegetables. And in exchange for that, I'm given a bit more of a predictable income than many farms have, and am able to have a more predictable relationship with my customer base, and some element of shared risk. Although I'm responsible for having a really good balance of crops for people throughout the year, exactly what I provide isn't promised, and some years are more bountiful than others. And so members over the years kind of ride with the waves of production and share some of that risk to some extent. I think I see the farm, in a sense, as a kitchen table in the local community. Kind of like when you go to a party and there's great music playing in one room, but actually all the great conversations and interactions are happening at the food table in the kitchen. There's many things I deeply love about my work. I love the seasonal rhythm of my life. I love working outdoors with my body. I love the tangibility of that. I love that I get to notice the natural world daily, and that my work demands that I pay attention. The more I'm attuned to observations, the more likely I am to notice the things that lead to learning, to making good decisions, to catching problems early so that I can deal with them better, and also to having the time to find the satisfaction or joy in a sprouting seed or the eastern bluebird in the tree line. That brief moment that a rainbow stretches over the greenhouse or a honeybee flies by with pink pollen stuck to its legs. I love feeding people, and I love providing an opportunity for members, and especially their kids, to connect with their food, to connect with the land, and to help make food meaningful, which I think makes food more delicious. I love hearing stories from members about their kids at the dinner table who look skeptically at a plate of vegetables and say, "Are these Farmer Angie's carrots?" and refuse to eat them if the answer is no. And actually, although it's not something I would have anticipated, it turns out I love running a business. Strategizing, pulling the vision down to the details, and then pulling the reality inherent in those details right back up to the vision is something that I imagine sewing might be like, except that's another thing this city Mennonite didn't learn. I even like the maddening puzzle of trying to eke out a living in the low margins, high risk industry of food. And also, I hate that part. As a person who is a planner and who likes to exercise more than a modicum of control over my life and the world around me, farming is actually a kind of terrible occupation to have chosen. There are days and nights when the stress of trying to anticipate and manage forces that are entirely beyond my control is exhausting. I think it would be honest for me to say that I do not fundamentally trust that everything will work out. Maybe that's a failure of faith, or maybe it's just a refusal to elevate myself above the many farmers whose crops do fail, who pray for rain and receive drought, who lose entire harvests to pests, wildfires, hurricanes, disease, and countless other catastrophes. So while my model of farming buffers me more than most from carrying the full risk of the outcome, I still feel vulnerable. And I'm very aware that my livelihood is dependent on processes of life that are playing out. I need them to play out according to my own plan, but life is tenuous. And there's other things that don't sit quite right. At least in our part of the world, farming is couched in a colonial view of land ownership. And as farmers, we tend to be very proud of our land. And wonderful things come of this sense of pride and ownership. But it can also lend itself to a certain forgetfulness that land in many ways defies ownership. The water and creatures that move through our landscape don't know property lines. And the decisions that we make on private property, especially properties as large and as integrated with the surrounding landscape as farms often are, they have impact far beyond the land that we hold title to. Fundamentally, one of the things I struggle with is that agriculture is at odds with natural ecosystems. And it's a bit of a bind, because as farmers, many of us are drawn to our work because of our love for the natural landscape. But there isn't a whole lot natural about our farms. Cultivated systems of agriculture work on very different principles than natural ecosystems. We cultivate monocultures. Nature loves diversity. We disturb soil and leave it vulnerable to erosion. Nature builds it through constant cover of deep-rooted trees and grasses and slow rock weathering. As farmers, our success, to a great extent, depends on our ability to contain and exclude the wildness of the landscape. So as an annual vegetable farmer, I'm guilty of a lot of soil disturbance through tillage. It's probably one of the most irresponsible things that I could do, especially in the face of climate change, when what we need to do is take carbon and put it in the soil instead of stirring up that soil and sending carbon up into the landscape, or up into the air. So much of farming here and now involves heavy use of fossil fuels in the forms of gas and plastic, And although I choose not to use any synthetic pesticides or fertilizers on my farm, these things are a huge part of agriculture on the whole in our part of the world. So I do what I can to mitigate. I have a broad crop diversity. Thankfully, this is also good for economic security. I try to build soil health using cover crops to keep the soil held in place, using healthy rotations, working to develop production methods that will minimize tillage, though I have a long ways to go on that front. And I try to leave wild spaces and actively create habitat for pollinators and beneficial insects. And to bring fuel use down by using solar-powered human labor when possible instead of depending as much on gas-powered tractors and vehicles, and distributing locally so that things aren't traveling so far. But I wonder often whether this is enough. And as a farmer in the Anabaptist tradition, I wonder what it means to be a pacifist in the context of our relationship with lands and landscapes. Farming is in some aspects inherently violent. It's violent to the land and natural ecosystems, and if I had more time, I'd talk about ways that farming is embedded in a system of economic violence that depends on food being undervalued, on farmers and food service workers being underpaid, and that pits rural against urban. So the question I want to leave us with is, as farmers and as eaters, what are the ways that our assumptions, our perspectives, and our practices around the production of food are and aren't at peace with the land?
Good morning, my name is Mark Reusser. Angie said a lot of things that I wanted to say, so I think I'm going to change what I'm going to say. No, I'm going to tell some stories instead. So at my operation, I produce about 800,000 kilos of turkey annually. I have a rather small farm in today's standards. I have about 130 acres. That 130 acres is farmed organically, not because I intentionally choose to farm it organically, but because, as far as I can determine, there was never a chemical put on that land in 200 years of farming. And I thought to myself when I bought it, potentially there's an opportunity here to utilize the fact that it's never been farmed any other way, to continue to farm it that way. And so I've owned that particular farm for about 7 years, and I'm still struggling to figure out how I can utilize the fact that it hasn't had a chemical on for 200 years, And I'm not there yet. It's a process, but I enjoy giving it a shot. So what do I do? Or what do I enjoy? I enjoy all of the things that I've always enjoyed with regard to living in the countryside and living in the country. And I remember the day when I was 7 years old, July of 1963, when I decided I would become a farmer. It was one of those hot, muggy, stifling days in central Ohio. And it was mid-morning, perhaps late morning, and I heard the sound of my Amish neighbor's hay loader in the field beside the house. And if you don't know what a hay loader is, it's a machine that made a lot of noise and took loose hay and lifted it up on top of a wagon. Somebody stood on that wagon and spread it around. So a very old-fashioned way of making hay. And I heard that sound, and I ran outside and went into the field, and my little friend Melvin was leading a team of 4 horses in his bare feet, walking beside the wagon, and his dad was on top of the wagon with a fork, shoveling and forking that loose hay around on that wagon. And I remember I jumped up on that wagon because I wanted to help. I was 7 years old, and stood beside Melvin's dad, the Amish guy with the big beard, and he was soaking wet and sweaty, and he smelled bad, and forking around this hay, and I remember kicking it around with my feet and helping, and myself sweating, and I thought to myself, this is the life, this is what I want to do. And I knew it right then. I knew I had a goal, and that's where I wanted to be. It took me a long time to get there, but I got there. So I still love those same things. I love being outside. I love the fresh air. I love the smell of hay. I love growing things, and I love growing things as much in my own garden as I do in a field. That's just what I love to do. What else do I enjoy about farming? I enjoy the the challenge of being as good and efficient as you possibly can at what you do. I think about that a lot. And with regard to how that meshes with my faith, is kind of a difficult thing to figure out. Because I'm in a sense competing with myself, I'm also competing with other people. If I want to be good, I measure myself and my production against my neighbors. And sometimes that feels good. Other times it doesn't feel as good. What don't I like? Sometimes that competition doesn't feel great. And I'll tell you another story because it's a time when I made a decision. This would have been the fall of 1994. And I, at the time, was farming in Middlesex County. And I was farming about 1,100 acres by myself. And it was a challenge. It was a lot of work. I worked probably 16 to 18 hours every day. I had 2 kids at that point. I left the house before they got up. I arrived back at the house after they'd gone to sleep. So I didn't even see my own kids except for Sunday. On that particular fall there in 1994, I was out plowing in a field. I was plowing beside a neighbor. And we just happened to be plowing in adjacent fields. And Pete Tweister, who's here today, would know who I'm talking about, and Deanie, his wife. It was Gerard Cornelius. Gerard was 20 years older than me. And he was my neighbor and, in a sense, my competition. And I plowed that field, and I plowed all day. I could see him beside me. He was in an adjacent field. And as we often did, I plowed all night. So I worked 24 hours. So did he. When we were done our fields, we changed fields, and lo and behold, we were at adjacent fields, farming beside each other again the next day. And we plowed all day. And we plowed all that next night. And we moved to another field, and we were beside each other. We could see each other's lights again. And on that second complete night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. My neighbor, who's 20 years older than me, is going to best me. And I don't want that to happen. And I thought, I will go home and I will have 2 hours sleep. I will come back out to the field and my neighbor won't be there because he'll see that I'm gone and he'll go to bed. I went back out to the field 2 hours later. My neighbor was still plowing. So at that moment, I said, this is not for me. There's got to be more to life than just competing against my neighbor. I know I can do it, but I don't want to do it. I only have one life. My faith tells me you can't do a single thing in your life. Life is a lot of different things, and your family is a significant part of that. And at that point, I decided I'm going to do something else. And I made a decision to go into supply management and to buy a chicken quota. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made. I don't begrudge anyone else who farms large acreages and competes. It just wasn't for me at that point. I didn't feel that it fit with my faith. So how does my Anabaptist faith influence my vocation? I've always been of the opinion, ever since I was a child, that farming and living in the country is part of my faith. It's singular. It's all one. As I said, I grew up in Amish country in central Ohio until I was 7 years old. There was a certain series of events that happened throughout the year, through the seasons. You planted in the spring, you made hay in July, you began harvest in August, you finished your harvest in October, and then there was Thanksgiving. And all my Amish neighbors did the same thing. We, living in the countryside, sort of participated in all those events too. It was all one. Religion, my faith, farming, and the environment was all one. And I've always looked at farming as not being singularly growing crops. I'm a steward. I've been called to be a steward of the earth, and I think we all are. In my mind, that comes from the first chapter of Genesis. I'm to be a steward. I am to look after the earth because I'm only here for a short period of time. I should leave the earth in as good a condition for my children and my future generations as it is for me. And if I can't do that, then I'm not doing what I should. And I believe my faith calls me to do that. So how does climate change influence how I farm? Well, that's an interesting question, and I sometimes struggle with what we call climate change as being the problem, and I think sometimes it's more a symptom of a bigger problem. And that the bigger problem is that we aren't good stewards of the land. We're not treating the earth as something that will be here forever. If you wreck it, it's destroyed. And I tend to look at farmland itself as being a perpetual resource. As long as you treat it well, it will produce food for you forever. It's also a non-renewable resource in that if you pave it over, it's gone forever. And I struggle with those things. I also think that in terms of climate change, as a farmer, I like to be both a producer of crops that people eat and also a producer of livestock that people eat. And I look at it as somewhat of a virtuous cycle. I take the sunshine, I take the rain, I take the nutrients in the soil, I grow a crop, I can feed that crop to livestock, that livestock is eaten by other people, and what the livestock put out their back end goes back into the soil and grows another crop. And in a sense, I think I'm recycling carbon. I'm going round and round. Yes, I use some more carbon than what I produce at times, and that bothers me. On the other hand, I think I'm doing as good a job as I can. Or perhaps I'm not doing as good a job as I could. I could do better. And I like to think that I could, and that's one of the things one of the goals I still have as a farmer is to be not only a better farmer, but a better steward of the environment.
Good morning. Good morning. Microphones and podiums are not a commonplace for me. So you'll just have to bear with me, I guess. A little introduction. First, I should introduce myself as I am Lloyd Frey, and that's apparently what my parents named me when I was a child, and that's what people still refer. Yes. In way of introduction, describe your farming operation. We're a third-generation dairy farm and have since incorporated the grain elevator business in with that. We would be the first generation that's in that particular aspect, but it's been a dairy farm since my grandfather bought the place in 1946, I believe it was, and it's just outside of the town of Elmira, and butts right up against the city limits, and that's where we are. So we run that place, and when I say we, me, my wife Shirley, which was a former employee of this particular place, some will still recognize that name or her, and our son Graham, which is he's still in high school. He's in grade 10 in what they call the ELOS program there at the Elmira District Secondary School, which is a 2-day-a-week program, and then corresponding as a follow-up or however. And then my younger brother and his family actually live on the farm. We're maybe a little different or unique in that aspect that I haven't lived on the farm myself for almost 24 years. So I'm actually live in the town of Elmira, but am a farmer. So commute to work every day, probably a half a dozen times every day because we go home for meals and whatever. So that's basically the background. But yeah, we can tie around 100 cows. We milk 90 or thereabouts normally. When I was growing up, we milked 20 cows, so it's been a gradual growth in that area, and gone from there. What do you enjoy about farming? That's probably a pretty broad subject, but maybe the first thing that comes to mind would certainly be just the diversity, the ability to not be, in some ways you're very much tied down, but in other ways you're your own boss and you have your own freedom. It's to me it's different than punching in the job at 8 o'clock every morning and watching the clock to see when it's lunchtime, and then again the same thing to see when it's quitting time because you're just wanting to get out the door. It's different than that. It's it grows on you, and it's a way of life. It's business and life kind of combined, I would say, and there's probably no life like it if somebody is geared to that nature. It's just I don't know how else to describe it, I guess. And so what part of your farming operation, or what do you not like about farming? Well, for sure, the first thing that comes to mind is I'm not a person that likes to sit at a desk, and the paper burden and the increase and all that's going on is between that and aging, I guess it's it has somewhat of a negative effect. So that's not the first thing, but a very important part of running an operation. As these things get more complex, of course, it's more important than ever, because you can do all the other things right, and if that's not lined up, then for sure trouble is ahead, and we don't want to go there. So on to the fourth topic there. I don't know exactly what I should say, but I think one of the things that definitely my Anabaptist background and that identity in the community requires me to be honest. That's expected, I believe, and I don't see that as a burden. I hope I'm doing my job, in coming through on that, because I think it's expected, and it probably should be that way for sure. It's part of life. So, do current issues or climate change influence? Is how the question is posted here. Again, I don't know that I have a real definite view or anything particular. It just one thing that does come to mind. It's something we hear a lot about. When I think back to the duration of my career, I think some of those things have had different terms over the years. I remember being at a meeting in the early part of my career, and the speaker went into great detail about the Ice Age and how this had happened 3 times, I believe it was, in the period of whatever his description was. I don't recall the words, but I don't recall hearing much about the Ice Age myself at these type of meetings. So something has changed. These things evolve, I think. I don't know. It just, to me, these things seem to need to take on new terms. That's maybe the way to describe it. Myself, like when I look at our production capabilities, when I look back to the beginning of my career to now, I think in probably all crops specific, and probably in livestock as well, we've doubled the volume of product that our fields will grow, like in the sense of a crop of corn, that the volume is doubled. Most other things, that the milk production in cows has changed dramatically, and that's where we're at today, I think. So I think with that, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Ed. Thank you.
Guess I'm the last one. Yeah, this is interesting. This is a really open-ended sort of discussion, which I finally discovered, because I thought maybe it was going to become clear last night that we were kind of honing in on some particular piece. But no, it's just like, it's wide open, just stories of this and that, because agriculture's, Angie actually, she was trying to put a heck of a lot into it. There's lots that we could talk about. It's like, where do you start? Because agriculture, food and farming it affects everyone, whether you're connected with land these days or not. So, yeah, so that for that reason, I didn't know what I was going to talk about, but I think, like Mark, I think stories that's a good way to go, and just talk about my own personal story, because there's lots of issues and topics that we could discuss, and we can do that maybe in our table discussions, but because, yeah, the Mennonite who farms, I wrote that down, or are you a Mennonite farmer? That is interesting. Are they different? So I grew up on a farm in Jordan, which is in the Niagara region, and I'm the fifth generation living in the house, I guess, not actually to farm. Fifth generation living in the house because my great-great-grandfather was a blacksmith, and he came over as an elderly person already, and it was his son and daughter-in-law that actually started farming on this property. So there are actually lots of people connected. People come by this house and they knock on our door and they want to take a look, and said, we used to live in this house. And I said, who are you? I don't even know all my relatives, but this house has belonged to a number of people over the years. And I mean, I do speak with pride that my kids are now the sixth generation in the house, but really 6 generations is minuscule when you talk about the lands being used by peoples before us. And but in Canada, 6 generations is pretty good. It's a long time in my perspective, anyways, my experience. So so we have vineyards. 54 acres in total, 7 acres of Niagara escarpment bush. We're in the green belt area surrounded by conservation area, Balls Falls Conservation Area on the one end, and other conservation area around us on the north and east. We have the Bruce Trail runs through our property as well. We have also a 100-year floodplain that now encompasses a lot of the buildings that have been built on our property that are in the floodplain. So I can't expand on them because you can't build anything in a floodplain. So we're really limited there over the years, but they were put there before the floodplain map was drawn. And of course the floodplain keeps increasing as, well, that's another whole topic. Anyway, my wife also, Laura, Mullet Koop, she was a Mullet, I was a Koop. We decided to give our kids the problem of figuring out what to do with a double name, so we threw Mullet Koop on all of them too. She grew up in northern Alberta, 7 hours straight north of Edmonton, in the Peace River country, and her parents ranched up there. They had cattle, so she's also a Mennonite farmer, I guess. But she's also a registered psychotherapist. She just graduated last year and is starting a practice and is working in a hospital in St. Catharines. So she's, yeah. We have 3 kids. Josiah is my oldest, our oldest. He's a second year at Guelph University studying agriculture science. Since 2 years old, he was always keen to be in the barn packing eggs with me. Our kids are not like both Laura and I were. Laura and I both were happy to leave the farm. My kids don't want to leave. You got to explore the world. You got to get out and see what else there is besides this little insular. The Niagara region can be quite insular. No, they just want to be at home. Why are you pushing us away? We love being here. Okay. They just love to be at home. So I still can't wrap it around my head how since he was 2 years old, he has not lost focus of wanting to continue this family farm. That I should say that my coming to the family farm is interesting. I think my dad thought he was going to be selling the farm because I had no interest. I went to CMBC, which is now CMU, and that was just a sideline to my pursuit. I was going to go to the University of Waterloo for optometry because I was really keen to give sight to the blind, because when I was 3 years old, I thought this was the most incredible thing, and I just wanted to pursue that and do that for other people. But CMU, or CMBC at the time, it was a great retreat, actually, 4 years retreat, because I did both a music and, it was really limited back then. I did music and theology. But in one of the classes, I also had a friend who had a greenhouse industry, big family business in Leamington, and he only spent a year there. And I could not believe that he just left after a year, because this is just so much fun. We got to stay and this is community life. I experienced a lot of, like, getting out of the Niagara region, going to CMBC. That was my first time off the farm, really. So it's like, yeah. Anyway, and then there was a class, an Old Testament class with a professor who some of you may know, Waldemar Jansen. We talked about land. And somehow in those studies, and I can't even remember exactly what it was, just an overwhelming sense of connection and importance of land. And then I suddenly realized that my whole upbringing was connected with land. I mean, we all are in many senses. We all are connected with land, but in a farming, particularly in a farming sense. And so that was kind of a sudden turning point where I actually contemplated leaving optometry and considering taking over the farm. So I just wanted to make sure it wasn't a passing fancy. And when we got married and we moved to the Niagara region, we rented a place in Vineland and worked on the farm for a while. And I wanted to make sure that I was actually really passionate about it, because I don't want to do it if I'm not passionate about it. But we really both felt that was something that we wanted to do. But prior to that, we had done a lot of global travel. We had worked with MCC and a number of other organizations, South Korea and India, and then also traveled to some other places. And what farming meant for us then was that we wouldn't be doing that for a while. So as soon as you buy a property and you have responsibility for land and animals, then you need to stay there and take care of them. So anyway, that's a long intro into sort of how I got onto what is now the 6 generations of family on this particular farm. The questions I actually don't have in front of me. What do I enjoy about farming? I remember that one. Well, yeah, as you know, I was drawn because of this connection with the land. It's a bit of a mystery, really. But I enjoy it because I think, like Mark, I'm also in, vineyards are not so much, but supply management is something that came in the late 60s with chickens, and we have eggs. And I really enjoy the collective work, because there's not so much competition. I mean, there's competition within supply management, but with the vineyards, I mean, in working with Peller Estates or Arterra Wines and Jackson Triggs, I mean, you're separate entities and you're competing, and you're really the small person. There's bullying that can happen in anything. And so I didn't like I don't like competition, but I find in supply management, and you have to work hard at keeping greed out of a system like that, but if you can, there's a real collective sense, a community sense, not family blood-wise, but family in a much bigger sense. And then the church being, say, the country of Canada, you're providing for. It's a metaphor, but I fit into that really well, and I appreciate supply management for what it's done for farming. In some ways, it's a legislated local food system, and it's kept farms like mine, which I would call small. We have 20,000 poultry. It's a big number. Some people flip over that number. 5th generation. I went to Michigan 2 or 3 years ago on a tour with our hatchery of a 3rd generation family farm with 18 million birds on it. 3rd generation. And they're successful, but they have challenges. So I'm a backyard flock, really, if you want to call me that. But most of us are in Ontario. All of us are in Ontario. We're backyard flock chicken farmers. But because we have, in the United States, you can count on your fingers how many farms provide the entire country with eggs, for example. In Canada, we have that much more. We have over 1,200 farms across the country, over 400 in Ontario. So the risk is distributed because, and we've seen some of these disease problems like AI in the US. One farm goes down, a quarter of the country doesn't have a supply. So they got to suddenly look somewhere else for food. It's like, so these are issues that intrigue me and are things that I enjoy about farming, because with an increasing population and a limited land base, how can we ensure a reliable food system going forward? And there's just so much, like Angie says, so many things to talk about. And I don't know, what was some of the other questions? I should just,
more minutes, wrap it up.
yeah, I should wrap it up. I could talk too long, but yeah, I'm intrigued by soil health, air quality, environmental controls, climate change. I mean, we're pulling out vineyards and planting new vineyards based on climate too, because some vines are more tolerant to heat, or some vines are more tolerant to cold. And I mean, for us, it's more the extreme weather events where you've got lots of cold or too much heat. I don't know where climate change is going, but I know it's real. And we have to work at it from all kinds of ends. How do we respond to it? How do we let's look at what's been causing it? I mean, we've got experts working at all that, so we don't have to do it all by ourselves. What do I like least about farming? Well, 60 or 70 years ago, 1 in 3 people were connected or actually lived on a farm. Today it's 1 in 100. People just don't know. And so we have an epidemic in our country where people they don't know where their food comes from, and somehow we as farmers have to convey that. And so now we can't actually spend all our time on the farm. Now we have to leave our farm, go into the cities, use social media platforms, and spend a lot of our time and focus on educating people about food. Because if we don't tell the story, this is the reason why, if we don't tell the story, someone else is going to tell it, and they're not necessarily farmers. And then it just puts all kinds of interesting information out there. So that's the part I like least. I mean, I like telling the story, but I don't like that responsibility has been forced on us. But it's just the reality of where things. Faith, that piece of it. I just see it as a pursuit of excellence in terms of food safety, animal care, environmental footprint, economics and food affordability, and worker safety, how you're balancing all these things. Those are all good values, important things to work towards. That's as much as I'll say in terms of how it's connected with faith, but it's pursuing those kinds of things. Social responsibility. I'll just end it there. That's where I'm going to end.
So I invite the panelists to come forward and have a seat, please. And we'll entertain your questions. Maybe there's something that boiled to the surface in the table conversations you had, or further thoughts that you'd like to develop. And whether to direct it to the whole panel or parts of the panel, maybe there are particular pieces that you have an interest in. So we'll open the floor to conversation. Please speak loudly from where you are, and then I'll pass the microphone to the respondents of your questions. Maybe I'll try and repeat your question so it's recorded as well. So, who has a question who would like to open our floor conversation?
I'll be brave and start.
Thanks for the courage.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, and I used to farm. We had a couple of things bubble up at our table, that's why I'm stealing the idea to the table. And I think what really sinks for us is this lovely idea, Angie, that you presented of the farm being like the kitchen table for a community, is how I envisioned that anyway. But how the culture of trust has shifted. And that seems to be a lot about what this is about. So I don't really have a question so much, but I just wondered if you wanted to touch on that. For me, from how I was raised, there was a shift for trusting margarine, which was manufactured in a factory, over butter, which of course is nature's gold, one of nature's gold, right? So that's a metaphor for my experience, but I just wondered whether you wanted to speak to something about this shift of the culture of trust.
So culture of trust.
You looking for one individual?
Yeah, somebody's going to reach for the mic.
I see it a lot with because we direct sell to consumers, and so I kind of see the consumer almost daily, the people that buy our produce. So a lot of them are very mistrusting of farms in general now. There's a very big vegan movement out there, and they have a lot of good rationale for becoming vegans. We obviously raise livestock, so we get a lot of lashback on social media from vegans, and so I feel like there's kind of two sides. I don't know. You get people that think farming is all like sundresses and wicker baskets, and I've had like a couple customers that are on the farm. They see me in my coveralls, and they're like, "Can I take a picture of you, like as a farmer, a female farmer?" And I'm like, "Sure, yeah, go for it." But then you have a lot of people, like, because we sell our eggs and poultry organic, a lot of people want to they don't trust that I'm actually feeding them organic feed. They want to see the label, and which is great. Like, that's that's them being wise in their decisions. But I feel like, farmers aren't trusted as much because of like Netflix documentaries and that sort of thing that people see.
I feel a little frozen because there's a couple things going on at the same time, and one is that certainly as our food system has become larger and more disconnected from a lot of people who are eating food, there's reason for distrust to develop, and some of that is sort of couched in this false sense that we have that things that come from factories are inherently safer than things that come from the chaos of a system like a farm. And there's a lot of false assumptions about what safety means and what regulations do and don't do. And so that is, partly there's a lack of trust that is definitely misplaced. And also, as farmers, we have done plenty to earn distrust. And there's lots of ways that farming contributes to problems in the larger world. There's lots of ways that farming has become, in many ways, more akin to a factory production method than something that is embedded in the natural diversity of the landscape, and all of the sort of requisite problems have come out of that. And there's been lots of abuses on farms. And so on the one hand, I like to encourage people to distrust the messages that are presented by farms and the food systems that distributes that product, because there's lots of lies in it. And on the other hand, I wish that we trusted natural processes more, and would see the health in the dirt as opposed to the health in the sanitized, metallic, plasticized systems a little more easily.
There's a lot of information in the world today. There's so much information, and we have such easy access to it. And so I think farmers have a responsibility to tell their story, because people are going to get a story from somewhere. And we have, I think, an opportunity to tell a pretty good story most of the time. In terms of productivity, we as farmers have increased our productivity an enormous amount in the past 50 years. And I think we need to tell people that. I'm using less fertilizer, I'm getting more yield. I'm producing far more with each individual corn plant than I did last year, the year before. Every year my productivity increases. And some people say, well, that's a bad thing. And I say, well, if you want to feed the world and you want everybody to have an opportunity to eat and eat well, somehow you have to do that. How are you going to do it? And that's a good news story, and I think farmers need to tell it. I think farmers also need to tell the story to urban people. My experience is when someone from the city asks me what I do and I say I'm a farmer, I am plied with questions. I don't have to think of what to say. I just answer, and I tell a story, and I tell a good story, and I say why I do something. And people are fascinated by it. And if people hear that story from a farmer, I think it has far more impact than it does if you read it online.
Dr. Chris. I just want to summarize that, because back to it's this whole idea of trust, and we talked about it at our table too. I think it really has to do with disconnectedness, and I think you can trust the farmers, but maybe the internet, where people have names that say I'm a farmer, but there's no face and no place, and maybe those are the farmers, quote unquote, you can't trust. But the real people out there, if we can get together, you can trust them and hear that story. But you're right, trust, that's huge, and that's just the way it is today.
Another question or comment?
Maybe building on that question of trust and getting more to like Mennonite church context, I've reflected on this value of reconciliation and peace building in Mennonite culture, and then this divide I see among farmers in some Mennonite churches. Some farm more conventionally, others more ecologically or organic or whatever. And I'm wondering, how do we apply this idea of reconciliation that's so important to our tradition to this particular tension or difference or conflict? And I'm wondering what people think about that.
Reconciliation in terms of styles of farming, reconciling our practices. Is there an asset or something in our tradition that helps us do that reconciliation work?
First, I can start even though I actually don't know what I'm going to say. This is just such an intriguing. I mean, this is, we live in a world of diversity. So how do we reconcile our relationships with the other people that live differently than us in every other aspect of our relationship with creation around us, not just in farming? So I'm just almost asking another question, to broaden it. How do we live in a reconciling way with this diversity?
Our farm is weird because we have the social enterprise aspects of it. But for me, I try and inject peace building on a daily basis with the volunteers that come. They usually come from a fairly broken place. And so the women from the women's prison and the youth from the expulsion schools will come and volunteer, and a lot of them don't have a lot of access to outdoor spaces, and so they get to have a sense of peace and accomplishment, knowing that when they come and work on the farm, you've just picked $100 worth of raspberries that are not going to be sold, and the profits go to MCC. So you've now helped give MCC $100 to help with food security overseas, and they derive, as we all would, a lot of accomplishment out of that, and that's kind of a piece of the puzzle for them in rebuilding a sense of purpose and a confidence in themselves in moving forward with a productive life and healing for them, I hope. That's my goal anyway. It's rather high and mighty, but this is attempting.
I'll give a secular answer and a faith answer. The secular answer is, if consumers want me to farm organically by the cycles of the moon, I'll do it as long as I can make a margin. I'm still producing food. Sometimes we farmers get hung up on how we do something. One's better than the other, and you're bad and you're good. We all produce food. My faith answer is, I try and tread lightly on the land and make sure that I'm a good steward. And the way I do it is not the only way to do it. There are lots of ways to do it. And I think as long as you're trying to do those two things, being a good steward and treading lightly on the land, there are lots of ways to be successful and provide food for people.
Back again.
I like your answer, Mark. That I was thinking along the same lines when he was the way he started there. That I was thinking of the different levels or elevations, and not to be sarcastic or by any means, but we have like organic, we have conventional, we have so on, and I'm totally fine with any approach, but I'm not sure that that we put that at levels. Like, to me, one can be as good as the other, and if that's what somebody chooses to do, that's fine, and you go from there. And I think for sure agriculture, the Mennonites were drawn to agriculture because of a simple way of life, I think, and therefore psychologically they maybe had less problems. As everything goes, these businesses become more intense, and I don't think we're as relaxed as we were probably a generation or two ago, and there's repercussions to that, and I'm not sure what the answer is. So.
If I might add one thing, what really bothers me is when we use the kinds of food we eat as a cudgel to attack somebody else. And I think that's wrong. One of the things that's brought us together as people of faith and as people in general is to sit down and eat together. You sit down and you eat and drink. You go to any culture in the world, and how do you treat a neighbor or a stranger? You sit down, you have a meal, and you have a drink. That's what you do. That shows friendship, that shows all kinds of things. And I find it really distressing when, and I don't know how to deal with it, when I have to decide what food I'm going to serve to someone when I invite them over for dinner. And I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to deal with it in terms of faith. I don't know how to deal with it in terms of practicality. I was always taught you ate what was set before you. And if I go to someone's house and they set before me something that I distaste, I'll eat it anyway because someone is showing friendship and fellowship with me. And so I find it really distressing to have to deal with the fact that some people eat differently than other people. For goodness sakes, if you're going over to somebody's house, eat their food. I'm sorry if that sounds judgmental.
That's real redneck.
I'll be brief. I like maybe in many farmers in general, I think we take pride in the food we produce, and there are different stories, and maybe like in every other area of life these days, we live in our echo chambers. And so while I, as an ecological farmer, may tell my story of the pride in what I do tied to terms of my impact on the land, the way I care for the soil, the way I distribute my food to my membership, and I have my way of telling a story, and it resonates with a certain community of farmers. And then in a more conventional farming community, there's still pride in the food that's produced, but the stories might be around the amount of food that's produced or around different things to do with the way that food is produced that I might articulate, but there's the same genuine, real, true sense of pride in what's being accomplished and in the mission. And I think in some ways we could use help in the farming community, figuring out how to talk to each other, how to learn from each other, to set ego aside. For me to learn that maybe some of the things that don't fit in my doctrine of right farming actually would help me produce food better. And for someone else who believes so much in their ability to produce large amounts of food to hear that maybe there are some impacts in the choices, there's some compromises being made that would be worth changing practices around, even if it means a little bit less production. But that's taboo. We have so much trouble having those conversations. So in terms of reconciliation, I would say intervention may be needed. It's really tough for us to talk to each other well and get outside of those echo chambers.
Within the small chamber of Egg Farmers of Ontario, we have, as many of you probably see in the grocery store, organic, free range, brown, white, vitamin D enriched, omega-3. Does it boggle you sometimes? Which one should I buy? This is a moral issue. What should I get? I don't know. Well, okay, so we as egg farmers for a while, we had a little bit of, I'm better than you amongst the egg farmers because we farm this way. We have this kind of housing system. We've really worked hard at getting ego, setting it aside, and fortunately we have a cost of production, so it does make it easier to change and do something a different way if people want it that way, because we're going to get paid for it. If you're not going to get paid for it, who's going to be the first one that's going to step up and say, well, I'll make $100,000 less, and you can just keep making what you're making. So, but there is but I agree. We need all farmers are really on the same page, so we all need to get together right across the board. I think we have lots to offer as a larger, expansive network of people, because there is more diversity than we really realize.
One more comment?
Question, please.
Well, folks, now it's time to review our social contract for the morning. We had intended to take this event till about 11 o'clock, and if you're fine with extending it past, in favor? Okay. And if you're opposed, please feel free. We won't chain you to the chair. But we didn't want to keep you through the whole morning, given the whatever your schedules are. Anyway, that means that there's space for about 11:15. So we'll aim for 11:15. Cut 2 or 3 more questions, John.
I want you to talk about the real elephant in the room. When I grew up on the farm, I think a farmer, it took 7 farmers to feed 100 people or something. We were proud of that accomplishment in the 50s when I grew up. Now it's significantly different, and the issue I think for me is the value of land, because all farmers need land of some sort as part of the ecosystem that they farm in, and it's becoming increasingly expensive. And I think one of the thresholds we live in is who will own that extremely valuable and rich resource. So I submit that the kind of farming you do depends on how much wealth you have. If you've got a lot, you'll farm 1,000 acres, or if you've got access to capital. If you don't, you'll farm 5 acres or 10, and you'll determine your system around that. It's an issue of land ownership.
Ownership of the means of production. This is a good Marxist comment, or Marxist base.
Yeah.
So let's give the panel a chance to ruminate on that for a minute.
Maybe they could tell us what's coming in the next 40 years.
Yeah. Give them the crystal ball right there.
Yeah.
Comment, size of operation, ownership.
As a 5-acre farm, I would beg to differ. I think it's all in your creativity. There's a lot of, definitely not the first one to farm a small farm and make a go of it. There's a lot of creative solutions out there, and making the use out of very small amount of space. There's like books out there, which there's a million of them. I think it's all in your creativity and how you want to do it, and I think it's possible. We were very lucky. I would say it's a miracle that we own the land that we do. We're on a floodplain in Cambridge, and it's really good soil, except it floods every year. So, but it goes away by the time the spring comes. Like, it's time to do something with it. So it's just about being creative and thinking outside the box. Like, we're in the middle of Cambridge. I took the bus here today because we've gone down to 1 car, and
I can do that, and my kids are going to have access to the bus when they're older, and we're in the middle of the city, and I don't know, it's about thinking outside the box. As a first generation farmer, I think that I've got there is a lot of advantages to being a first generation farmer, but there's some advantages because you have to kind of think and figure it out, and you don't have access to land right away.
And yes, I think it's quite possible to make a living off a small piece of land, and some types of farming lend themselves better to that than others. But I think you're exactly right. The value of land is not attached to its value for food production anymore. Certainly not within a couple hours of cities anywhere. And so there is an inherent privilege that is required. You can either gain that privilege through your heritage and accessing land through your family prior ownership, or you can access that privilege through wealth, and you can spend it to purchase land. But I see a crisis looming in that area because of the pressure that is on land associated with the high value that comes with development pressure, and sort of fundamentally attached to the way we don't value food production really in our country. I think it's apt.
Do you want to follow up? I don't know whether I want to follow up other than to talk about challenges that are before us, and then they have been addressed partially by the group, illustrious group in front of us. I think that some of you must have grown up in the Elsa Craig area when I listened to some of the context of comments. But anyway, we have two major challenges as producers of food. One is to feed an ever-growing population in the world. What do we have? 7.5 billion, give or take, and predicted that not long from now we could have 10 billion people to feed. That's one challenge. The other challenge is the opposite, the challenge of abundance. We produce so much. In Canada, for example, you know that approximately half of gross farm income comes from an exported commodity. We feed the world. We can be proud of that. Those are the realities. Farming can be a lifestyle, but then there's the real issue of feeding the world, you know, and how do we address that? Because I think, and I'm coming from a non-Mennonite background, although I was born within walking distance of where Menno Simons lied his wares. But anyway,
maybe there was something in the oxygen and the minerals there.
In Holland, the Netherlands, last year, they had a major upheaval. I don't know how many of you follow that, where a cabinet minister made the statement, the reason for global warming is agriculture. And he got railroaded out, you know, by protests and tractor demonstrations and what have you. You know, there's so much untruth being spread around today. I think we try to do our best. Now, I see capital coming into the picture. Prices of land are beyond the reach of the new generation. How is that new generation going to follow or work on those challenges that I talked about? You know, we waste more food over and above what we produce. We waste more in North America than could be eaten by the rest of the world in poverty. Sure. You know, we sometimes don't remember that, and yet we get more rules and more regulations. Anyway, convoluted question, but anyway.
I think Mark's got something for you.
Okay, with regard to challenges, and there are many, and I'll deal with one specifically because I deal with that in my businesses with the Federation of Agriculture. We need to produce food to feed people. We also need to keep in mind that we have an environment outside of the individual farm field that we also need to preserve, because that's part of our whole environment. So that includes the rivers and the streams and the quality of the water in those rivers and streams and the bush and whatever else is providing oxygen and so on, the things that we need to live on this earth. So how do you balance producing as much food as you can to produce for people to eat, and at the same time protecting the rest of the environment, which is good? And that's really tough, because market signals tell me as a farmer, I need to focus on making my margin and making money. That's what economics tells me. I have to do that. On the other hand, if I'm doing that solely, I'm not looking after the rest of the environment as well as I should. So really, there should be perhaps a signal from society that says, we value the fact that you produce food and we'll pay you for it. We also value the fact that you are a steward of the entire environment, and perhaps society should pay you for your goods and services that you provide that benefit all of society. And for goodness sakes, farmers in Southern Ontario own most of the land. We're the stewards of the land. But nothing in terms of economics tells me to do the right thing. So I'm left with, I'm doing the right thing because I believe it's the right thing. And my faith tells me I should do the right thing. But there's no economic signals telling me that, yes, we appreciate you for what you do. So how do you deal with that? And that's really tough.
Yeah, and when the economics are really strained on many farms, it actually becomes an impossibility sometimes to make the right choice. And then we hold it against farms for making decisions that might be poor for the broader landscape, but we're not supporting in a real way the capacity to make those decisions differently.
And then people get really cranky at you for having high prices.
We'll leave the last question or comment to Paul.
Well, it's mostly a comment. You know, I was reading the New York Times this week, and there was a man talking to a well-educated woman, and he said, let me interrupt your training and education with my self-confidence. And I have found it very disturbing in social media, in particular, the attack on agriculture as the blame for global warming. And what I found so refreshing today was hearing from farmers. And I keep wanting to write that down in Facebook or wherever I see this, say you gotta go talk to a farmer about this. And what I love about this panel, and really applaud the organizers, is the diversity of voices that we had here today. And it just wanted to say it really makes me hopeful for our future, because I think the real issue, as was brought up here today, is food security. And that's a very complex issue, both in Canada and around the world. So well done, thank you so much.
So then let me conclude with a few comments and our gratitude. I'm not sure, I am kind of sure where you're from. This may not have been the old country out in New Hamburg or Schmittsville up in Wellesley. What's the one out in Tavistock?
Quail.
Yep, might not have been that one. It might not have been Butterball down in Jordan Hollow. But what we have had are conversations that occur every day in all of those places. And we come full circle. We started this morning with a prayer of gratitude, and we end today with grateful hearts. And Paul articulated it very well for us. It's been good to share our stories, experiences, thoughts, and cares. And we hope that this time of conversation has reminded all of us of all of our blessings. The blessing of, as Winfield Fretz referred to it, this sacred vocation. The blessing of this earth and its gift of life, and the blessing of those who spend their life in this service. So we thank you for offering that, whether as members of the panel or as farmers otherwise, and as good gardeners and eaters. So thanks to all of you for your thoughts and reflections. Thanks for the work of your days. May God's grace bless your homes, your fields, your barns, your gardens, your vineyards, with sun and rain and a fall in good time and good measure. Thanks to all of you for coming to breakfast. Thanks for your interest and care. May God's grace bless you with a healthy table measured by laughter, sustaining all in need, and may all of our blessings be blessings for all. Thanks also to Lester for buying us breakfast. That's great. Peace and safety for your journey from here to home. Go in peace.